Well, it's a nice last day of class.
Oh, yeah.
It's like the memory of the last day is nice.
So when you're leaving to USS?
On Sunday.
Sundays. Oh, definitely.
So Friday I have a lecture.
Name?
Yeah.
I think my friend will come also.
And then I have some other stuff. But yeah, it's just my schedule is always very, very tight. So someone was recently asking me, "What do you do to unwind and relax?" And I said, "It's been so long since I've known that concept. There's just so many demands." And
Are you teach master class there?
where?
UCLA?
No, at UCLA, I'm a chaired professor of law at UCLA School of Law. So I teach law classes, including Islamic law, of course, but also human rights, and political asylum, comparative law, international human rights. So it's and my own favorite legal philosophy.
Legal philosophy.
Yeah. Jurist and philosophers.
Jurist and philosopher.
And when you talk about process, I'm just wondering whether it's also related to the high geography of the sainthood, for example, in the Sufi tradition.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the Qusas in the Sufi tradition. This is just my own opinion, because there hasn't been a lot of scholarship done, and so. But my own is that they perform a different role than the sort of gypsy Qusas that would move from just one village to another, entertaining in cafes and getting paid and so on, because the Qusas within Sufi tradition used to be order specific, Sufi order specific. You know, they belong in the Naqshbandi, and they seem to be far more, their whole qasas, it's really part of the mystical view of the particular Sufi order, and also it seemed to serve the methodology of the particular Sufi order. And so, you know, when I find, because you could still find this in Egypt quite easily, you find books that documented some of the stories within the Naqshbandi tariqa, within the Rifa'i tariqa, and so on. And if you know something about the training and the methodology within the Naqshbandi or the Rifa'i or the Qaqashandi or so on, you're struck by how it seemed like the development of the narrative and the moral of the narrative is very much geared towards particular philosophical orientation. You see this, for instance, quite clearly in Hafiz, or in Muthanna, the famous text. In a lot of they're not just mystical stories, but they're mystical stories that are well integrated within a particular Sufi order, and directly address the worldview of the Sufi order. Just to say another word about the fuqaha, generally the fuqaha did not, hello, did not treat the, they did not engage the qusas. I mean, that did not seem to be of any interest in them. I mean, they're and not even in the level of trying to refute or engage or criticize or so on. But the Ahl al-Hadith were of great relevance because this was the factory that produced the hadith that ultimately the fuqaha would use as material. And but the fuqaha would not take the fuqaha would not take simply the Ahl Hadith people would produce the judgments about particular traditions, whether it's authentic or weak or munqati' or whatnot. A jurist had the faqih had a role of taking this tradition and putting it, balancing it within the totality of evidence, within a particular methodology developed within a school of thought. So, for instance, they would look at, okay, so there's here a tradition. What other traditions are on the same issue? Are they consistent or inconsistent? Are they inconsistent because they address different contextual situations? What is their relationship to the Quranic text? What is their relationship to customary practices locally? A lot of times, hadith had a geographic lineage. So we have a lot of hadith that we have a Yemeni version of a hadith, and then a Kufi version of the hadith, and a Shami version of the hadith. And the question is not just the chain of transit, but substantively the content of the hadith would differ. So part of what a jurist does is that to evaluate this sort of geographic locus and geographic it's clear that the particular narrative has come through a particular socio-cultural, geographic process, and so in what way does this inform the process of legal deduction? In Speaking God's, I saw Speaking God's Name with you. Do you still have the?
I have it.
Is it with you?
Oh no, I don't bring it.
Oh, you didn't bring it?
I don't bring it.
Well, if you look at Speaking God's Name, there's a point in the book where I talk about the difference between what the function of a muhaddis is and the function of a faqih is, and I talk about what are the factors that the faqih evaluates in taking a particular report and considering it within the totality of evidence, the totality of adillah. And one of the points that I make is that when you look at the elements, the methodological elements that they were supposed to weigh and balance, they are remarkably complex. And I actually produce a list of some of the very common principles of evidentiary weighing or balancing of evidence or evidentiary standards that you find quite commonly in books of usul al-fiqh, books of Islamic jurisprudence. And of course, now, as I explain in the book, which of these many factors, and I mentioned, I think, about 100 of these factors, which of these many factors gets more emphasis on the other, it depends on the school of thought, on the particular madhab that you're working with. And so the juristic process required a great deal of training in methodology of law. I mean, that is really most of where especially the more advanced you got in your studies, the more the more you approach the level of a mujtahid, or mujtahid mutlaq is quite rare. I mean, and the type of jurisprudential, and often even people like Abu Yusuf or Shaybani, or they would not claim to be a mujtahid mutlaq. People would sort of give them that attribute, and typical of the juristic culture, there would be some resistance to it, of saying no. And that's why, for instance, when Abu Yusuf and Zufar and Shaybani, they were, Zufar in particular and Abu Yusuf, they were urged to break away from the Hanafi school. And so, well, your thought is distinctive enough to declare it your own school, and they refused. Mm-hmm. And they refused because they had this discourse of, well, I'm not a mujtahid mutlaq like my mentor, and of course, we know that, but it did happen with Hamad and Abu Hanifa. So yet again, I emphasize that when you come to the function of an imam, rare indeed that you will find an imam who even has any idea the difference between a book on Usul al-Fiqh by Baydawi and a book on Usul al-Fiqh by Subki or Al-Amadi. I mean, all of this has become relegated to the realm of forgotten knowledge. They might preserve the text, they might even, among the very interesting experiences in a recent visit to Azhar, an indication of how things have deteriorated even more. I was looking for particular books, and so I went and met with some of the shuyukh in the Azhar library, and was asking them about these books, and the reaction I got, well, these books are, no one is specialized enough to know where these books are now, or to know. I actually wanted, one of the texts I wanted to read was a jurist, and I had a very hard time finding a jurist who would say, yes, I'm qualified to read this text. This is part of this, that process where we go from 1.5 million manuscripts to barely 150,000 preserved, with just a couple of manuscripts published, and in a critical historical legacy such as that of Timbuktu in Africa. Now, of course, all of this is a backdrop to both the types of issues that I've the big questions, the big questions of the role of a Muslim intellectual in a contemporary world, and a Muslim intellectual in a vis-a-vis Western society, if they live in Western society, and And these are type of questions that concern me in the great theft and in the place of tolerance. And actually, let's focus on the place of tolerance now because it's time. So, how many of you, who did get a chance to go through the whole thing? Now, how would, I won't say anything about my main argument, but in the range of responses, how would you categorize them? I mean, what types of responses do I ultimately, what categories do they fall?
Could I say, I think that it's wide-ranging in terms of the type of people that responded and the ideologies. Of them, you have a lot of people who come from a more political sciencey sort of background, who are not comfortable with theology and or are very staunchly secularist, so don't believe that it's an important element of culture, or that it shouldn't be, or what have you. So they, like I was saying the other day, they sidestep the theology almost completely. Then you have like progressive Muslim like Amina Wadud, who just more or less agrees with you and has a fine point she wants to expand. You have kind of your irate kind of, will be interviewed on Al Jazeera angry character like this Abdullah John. And then you can feel the rage. And
how he creates, the logic.
And with no real reference to any ethical standards in Islam. Islam is just a community that must push itself forward and all this, and must defend itself. And then you have kind of the nice kind of sort of thing you would find at Tilburg, the kind of very, the kind of, Catholic but ecumenical, kind of welcoming of the Muslim discourse and actually saying a kind of alliance in it. This is Scott Appleby, there's a sense of similarity. Those were, I think, most of the people that I found.
Very much, of course, this pedagogically, it's a wonderful experiment in the numerous forces that pull at a Muslim intellectual, right? On the one hand, most would agree that culture is quite significant. And we know that culture becomes so embedded that it even affects so-called near-death experiences and what people see upon a near-death experience. Culture goes quite deep, and we experience this normative element, whether the normative element is attempting to deconstruct or attempting to reinforce culture. But then we have at the same time the stark reality of a discomfort with the particulars of theological discourse and theological ethics, right? It's like it's like we can quantify, we can empirically study and record culture and practices and so on, but theology is too elusive for us to attempt to think about seriously. Now, of course, we have a wide range here. We have a range sort of saying, well, okay, yeah, we respect, this is your business and we respect that, and good luck with it. To Tariq Ali, who says it's completely not important.
It's not theological.
It's not a theological issue. This is, but interestingly, now Tariq Ali later on, he shortly after this, he writes his book, The Clash of Fundamentalisms, and the Clash of Fundamentalisms is not a study on clashing sociologies. It's a study on clashing normative ideas, so worldviews, which he says, there's the sort of Western fundamentalist outlook, which is as bad as the Muslim fundamentalist outlook, and so the irony is that Tariq Ali finds himself ultimately forced to deal with normative arguments and to say, well, but these arguments are fundamentalist. It's as if he would prefer a different set of normative discourses that perhaps have to do with historical materialism, or normative discourses that have to do with class dynamics and developmental studies, whatnot. But you cannot escape the fact that there is a presumptive judgment about the role that religion ought to play in things, as opposed to what religion actually does. But at the same time, the response of someone like Jadullah, who comes in and says, this is sickening. Since colonialism, Muslims have been apologizing, defending themselves. Enough is enough. And to sort of even throw the screw in, he says, well, for instance, all the verses this guy talks about, verses talk about tolerance and so on, they've all been abrogated by the so-called jihad verse, right? And it's very fascinating because if you've noticed in the reply, what do I say about this? Did anyone notice that?
You said, because it went back and forth, because someone else said, well, actually they're not abrogated, and then you responded and said, well, I thought it was very interesting, that actually the idea that you can know exactly in what order revelation was given is a kind of a myth. It's a theory that people have of order. But you said that it's not, in fact, no one knows for certain.
Yeah, and I also said there are many different schools of thought as to whether, and I have cited all various opinions, or at least sources that document various opinions about whether this verse abrogated anything, and whether it came later or it came earlier, and so in here again, Jadullah seems he's defending something, but it is not. It seems to me like it's not the normative discourse. He's defending. His argument is more about an attitude or an ethical position, rather than a doctrinal argument.
Conspiracy.
But is it? I mean, this is a really important question, though. I mean, ethically, when is it an act that perhaps one can even say an act that it's unethical to dignify or to acknowledge the legitimacy of bigoted judgments by caving in and saying, well, I am going to talk about the place of tolerance, and I'm going to say what in affirming that is the tolerance in Islam, it is affirming that Islam stands accused. And in that, my position is fundamentally unethical. I mean, if Jadullah was more articulate, he could have put it that way, right? What do you think? I mean, is that a point?
I think it's a kind of a point in a kind of abstract way. I think, I mean, you shouldn't have to defend and all this. This is the ignorance on the part of the other to even raise. But I think that in practical terms, it seems overwhelming, the demand to defend the tolerance of the Muslim. I mean, it doesn't seem, this is also a bit looking at it from a broad angle, it doesn't seem possible to get away from the question.
Yeah.
However ill-informed in some ways it might be, but...
Both angle, in my opinion, it's logic. I mean, the doctrinal angle in what you're saying that we, in my opinion, that we have a problem in Islam itself. But also in Abidullah Jan, I also kind of, in my opinion, reading his writing, it is also possible that it's not always about doctrinal. It's also from the social factors, like he said, like what Israel did something like that, Muslim in Bosnia. In my opinion, it also kind of give another influence so that Muslim is not only about doctrinal. So in my opinion, it's also both of the logic is quite possible to think something like that.
One way that I approach this is contextuality and place. Looking at political dynamics and sort of what offensive assertion of power resulted into a counter-offensive assertion of power, that does have its valid and legitimate role, but is it the role of, I mean, if in my view, has become obvious by now that I see a theologian as an ethicist, a person thoroughly engaged in the project of ethics, and to say, well, understand that you've got to understand this at an emotive level, at a psychological level, and leave it there. It seems to drop the ethical question altogether. I mean, it assumes that tolerance as a virtue does not need to be negotiated through a human agent who affirms its place as a virtue. It sort of assumes as if the divine place of tolerance as a virtue is obvious, apparent, and automatic. But I mean, empirically, we see that that's not true. I mean, just look at the level of intolerance that you see exercised by Wahhabis against Shi'is or against Sufis, or even the level of intolerance today by Sunnis against Shi'is in Egypt, for instance. And so within Islam, but also without. Now here, part of the fundamental, what Jabal won, and I think a lot of intellectuals find the position they find themselves in, is on the one hand your fidelity to a normative discourse, right? Makes you want to engage this discourse and make a normative point within that discourse to affirm a principle. But on the other hand, you do not wish to do that from the point of view or from the position of the person who stands accused. You know, it's like you want to go out of the courtroom and then make that point. But if you are under assault, you say, stop